This is The Strange Recital, a podcast about fiction which questions the nature of reality.
The narrative. The occasion on this fall afternoon was to honor a man who now stood before an audience assembled in the Adelaide High School auditorium with yellow-gray hair, glasses, and a fine, if old-fashioned suit. The slight man looked out and waited. As the applause that had accompanied the hero to the podium began to fade, he lifted a hand to stop it.
When you're making up your narrative as you go, you may develop whole sections of action and dialogue for one purpose, only to change your mind later on, and then, out of some silly attachment, you don't delete them. Instead, you recommit them to the new purposes, leaving them as they are. You do so because the old purposes bring their own flavor to the mix, like a well-seasoned pan, or an old man with a lot of experience.
The speeches of learned men often begin with irony and build from there. The smiles that had burst upon the attentive faces, assuming there was a joke there somewhere, lingered. The story of his deeds had one literal meaning. He had rescued 2 young girls from a dangerous abductor and had relieved that man of his miserable existence and brought closure to the girls' families. But there was a backstory that gave the whole affair a different meaning. It involved a woman with whom our hero had corresponded as a young boy.
It may be that I'm a fool with a weakness for literary motifs, but motifs, my friends, are guides to life and action. They rule in politics as well as in arts.
He had not consciously intended to rescue the girls, least of all kill someone in the process, but he had done it all for that letter-writing woman in some strange way. He went on without his notes.
Memories began to resurrect themselves the moment I arrived in Adelaide. Her name, by coincidence. No relation to your quiet township and my friend's given name. Nevertheless, once the perfume was unstoppered, I was reliving as much as remembering. I was tearing open Adelaide's tissue-thin envelopes, running from the mailbox to the lawn, feeling the sun on my crown, seeking the shade of a wonderful old sycamore tree, and seeing her words on her pale blue paper as clearly as I had so many years ago. Suddenly, her heartbreaking story became significant in extraordinary ways to what was going on here. I dare say everyone here has heard the story of what I did, but none of you knows what was going through my mind at the time, and how the different connections I was making colored the picture for me and made me, of all people, catch what should have been irrelevant. My friend Adelaide had been held captive during the war. I was thinking about her horrible ordeal when I heard about Amy and Joan, the children of the town of Adelaide, who had been missing since July. You have called me a hero and shown me the depth of your gratitude. For you, a hero is probably someone who knowingly and selflessly risks his life to help others. I may not be that kind of hero, but I may be another kind if you allow me. In literature, a man can be a hero today merely if he is the focal point of the story. This hero is the one whose thoughts are known.
Saying this, he tapped with slender finger on his large skull. There would be regions inside this prodigious orb where thoughts might only communicate with each other, making almost no contact with body or, through it, world. Deep in that head, discussion might play in an endless loop about possible things, impossible things, generating, by the divine ability of being discrete, a pattern that is a new idea. The old man had lost his thread. He looked into the far distance and smiled to himself.
He cannot be this hero, the player who has not one soliloquy. It's not enough to be struck and to strike back. Reaction is not heroic, not in the sense to which I aspire. To be hit indirectly in that organ of sympathy and to respond obliquely with the mind is to me to be the master of great creative action, to be heroic. I do not know if I deserve to be called this latter kind of hero, but it is the only kind that I might possibly be because I am not the other, however much you might like me to be. And I do want to be a hero of some kind for you, since you've gone to all this trouble. If I can try your patience a moment longer, I will recreate my mind in those hours. My friend Adelaide knew my father in the war. In what capacity and how well were details we avoided with delicacy and mutual respect. Suffice it to say that she was with him when he died, and had promised to contact me when I came of age to explain to me certain things. I never told my mother about Adelaide. We exchanged letters for more than 2 years, until her death, though she was not yet old. She and my father had been held together and tortured, each within sight of the other. She survived, and he did not. I had been in your town for 2 hours, maybe 3, stopped for lunch. I half overheard conversations at the diner, saw the signs about the missing girls, saw the look on Sheriff Thomas's face. When I was driving out of town and that amazing sycamore near the Kruger place came into view, I stopped. A hoary, noble tree with its many blanched trunks splitting off from the main, standing perfectly centered in the frame of that beautiful valley. Nothing could be more idyllic. No place could seem a less likely backdrop for cruelty. I got out of my car and sought its shade. To think of her was all I had in mind. So absorbed was I in my own memories that I wasn't thinking of the pain of the 2 girls or of their abductor. I didn't mean to be a hero. I'm just a bookish old man who had never fired a gun before that day. And yet, I accepted your gratitude, let you call me hero, let you think I was bravely following a hunch where to look for the girls. In a moment of remorse, I almost declined your offer to appear today, but I finally decided that in some very bizarre sense, I did save the girls exactly as intended. It was luck, yes, that made me walk toward the right tree, but I wasn't being pushed along by life's vicissitudes. My own structured thoughts had driven me there. So then I had got myself to the right place at the right time. I heard a cry in the barn and ran toward it. That part was instinct, and I take no credit for it. A small voice in pain drives all men, proverbial woodcutters, to answer. When I opened the door of the barn, I was actually thinking about Adelaide's torturer. I saw Potter holding one of the girls. In a stream of vicarious hatred and fear, red hot like molten iron, I was able to do what should have been impossible for a man like me. I saved Adelaide to town because my father could not save his Adelaide. I actually saved Amy and Joan, but that's not what I thought I was doing. If this begins to sound more like deranged manslaughter than heroism, let me assure you that I had the presence of mind to realize immediately what I had stumbled upon. So it wasn't quite pathological madness. My faculties of reason were employed, but the ruling emotions that made it all possible came from elsewhere. I had the advantage of surprise, his, but more importantly mine, and I grabbed Potter's gun. You wonder why I have to spring this on you here, now, in this way. I do not take it lightly, the social contract that I break, appearing here to accept your gracious honor, then telling you that there's a story behind that honorable act that will change its meaning. But tell me, can I still be your hero on these grounds? Are they enough?
He put his hands at his side and waited. Signs and symbols. Of course I knew that you would see it, said the novelist, chuckling softly, pushing away his dessert plate after having meticulously scraped up the last faint smudges of strawberry sauce and cream. like an artist with a palette knife. Minsk smiled hesitantly. Seen it? He wondered. But then he shrugged bashfully and accepted the compliment. Now satisfied that Minsk had indeed seen it, the novelist laughed and winked. Minsk laughed too, pretending. Nervously, Minsk picked up a dried date and tried to pop it into his mouth. The date missed the target, fell to the floor, and Minsk watched it roll over the grimy, garish floral carpet and finally come to rest up against another diner's shoe. Later, as they left the restaurant, the novelist clapped Minsk's shoulder and told him, again, that he appreciated his writing the review for the Times. The only thing, though, he said after they started to back away from each other on the sidewalk, don't spell it out for the reader. Just give a good enough hint. You have my permission. Minsk grinned and nodded unconvincingly and turned on his heels toward home. He had already let the gaffe go too far to admit that he hadn't seen it, and now it was clear that the man wasn't speaking generally about plot twists. He was alluding to a deeper meaning to his novel that only a certain kind of reader would recognize. At home, when he flicked on the kitchen light, an enormous roach that resembled perfectly a dried date scurried across the stove and disappeared between the counter and the refrigerator. Minsk put his book bag heavily on the kitchen table, draped his raincoat over the chair, and set to making a pot of coffee. His kitchen window looked out into an air shaft. Across the way, that young single mom, whom he had yet to meet on the street, so maybe she didn't really exist in the real world, only in the air shaft theater, washed dishes. Her 3 noisy boys would be in bed. He regarded her as she violently shook her hands dry before patting them with a tea towel and left the room in darkness. Minsk suddenly felt conspicuous there in his lighted space, peering out at her absence, and went back to the coffee. Why does he think I got it? He wondered. Did I say something at dinner, or does he just think I'm up to his caliber? He sat down and took the novel out of his bag. It was thumbed, worn at the edges. He'd dog-eared no less than 20 pages and had jotted notes all over the margins, circled words, labeled phrases, noted themes, and pointed back and forth between different passages. Books love to be marked up, he thought. They don't want to be respected and put on a pedestal. They want to be used up, entered, pulled apart, rearranged, digested. He could never give up a book once he'd made his notes in it, after it had become part of him. He loved rereading books after 10 or 20 years and stepping into his old thoughts again in the margins. He couldn't read e-books like he could a paper book. He'd tried the highlighting function and recording notes with a click, but he preferred his own hand, his large, florid capitals, especially the F's and the T's, and his minuscule lowercase cursive, like fine, tangled arabesque. As an image, a marked-up page was aesthetically compelling, especially the way he diagrammed and drew arrows and stars. He mused for moments about launching a career as a conceptual artist, or whatever they're called, showing his artwork in fancy galleries. Or someday, when he published a collection of his reviews, he could include facsimile copies of his marked-up pages. But that would be putting the critic ahead of the creator. He didn't like that. Was he the kind of reader that the novelist needed, expected? Do writers write for me? He mused. He cracked the book open in the middle. The spine was already so broken in so many places it hardly mattered. Where to start? It was pointless, he decided, to reread the bits he had already analyzed. The thing to be done was to start again at the beginning. Now that he had been made aware of a secret design, he would be a different kind of reader. Already he had identified all the oh-so-subtle allusions to the lines in famous novels, poems, and historical quotes that echoed throughout the masterful prose. But that was just detective work. What he seemed to suggest that evening over coffee was something much more mysterious. What kind of message would have to be hidden? What kind of message would one want to hide? Did he feel censored? Was it political or personal? Was it something embarrassing that he felt the urge to confess through a screen? The coffee was ready. He poured it out black and started reading page 1. No, he went back to the preface and read that. Then the afterword, then back to page 1. 12 hours later, he was 3/4 of the way through again. In a state of spiritual ecstasy, he stood, mentally, on the threshold of meaning. He had seen the patterns. Words, like stars in the night sky, formed tangential connections. Sounds and shapes divorced themselves from their logic and echoed each other with a punning wit. He had laughed out loud many, many times throughout the reading marathon. But truth be told, he hadn't quite put his finger on it, had he? He inhaled deeply and put his hands to his chest, exhaled. Perhaps that was it. That feeling of being on the verge of understanding the greatest of all mysteries, of having full throttle faith that there is a mystery. He stopped there. He didn't want to get to the end. He wanted to stay there, right on the brink.
That was Message Without a Sender, made up of 2 stories, the narrative and Signs and Symbols, written and read by V.N. Alexander, with some help from Brent Robertson.
Hello, Tori. This is your 3rd time on The Strange Recital. Welcome back.
Hi, thanks.
Yes, a couple of years ago we did an episode called Mino's Stories, which featured 2 very short pieces like the 2 we just heard. Are these from the same collection?
Yeah, it's the same collection called Chance That Mimics Choice, which is kind of an extension of the work I do in science, looking at how mindless nature can make Pavlovian-like associations or take actions based on false similarities. My science mind and my fiction mind are in conversation a lot.
I enjoyed the way both of these stories, the narrative and Signs and Symbols, were told from the borderlands, from outside the center. Some people would say that the story is in the actual saving of the young girls by the old man, or in the actual content of the novel that the reviewer is reading, but we don't really get to see those. You push back against that cliche, so that your stories are at a remove, or maybe 2 removes, multiple layers of viewpoint and meaning, not about the center so much as reflecting on the center, a house of mirrors in a sense. Any thoughts about this?
That's a very nice description. I can't really improve on that. Reflecting on the center. I think artistic fiction is always about the way the story is told, not about the plot per se.
Hear, hear.
In the narrative, there's a place where you mention thoughts communicating with thoughts, somehow separate from the brain and body. Are you referring to the subconscious as perceived in popular psychology? Or are you suggesting that thoughts lead their own existence beyond human consciousness?
Well, actually, I was thinking of Terence Deacon's book, The Symbolic Species. This is oversimplifying, but he suggests that self-consciousness evolved as a side effect of large brain size. Some parts of the brain observe light, others sound or touch by receiving signals from the outside world. But buried deep in the brain is the self-conscious part that can only observe signals coming from other parts of the brain, the subconscious parts. And so that's what these stories do, too. They're stories about story making, the self-conscious narration. The subconscious part of the stories are the poetic elements that interact in illogical ways, and the self-conscious writer can observe them and make further meaning out of them. I guess I'm saying that the story is like a brain.
Okay.
I like it. The elderly man in the narrative, I identified with him, and I liked his realism about the nature of heroism. Humans have such a need to raise up heroes, I think it's done us a lot of terrible damage. But that's off topic, I guess. So actually, one thing I see in this story is an old man who is not just a senior citizen, but maybe taking on the role of wise tribal elder, which is something we desperately need.
Thanks for taking on his dialogue. That's not off topic at all. I think the old man is complaining about the traditional notion of heroism.
Mm-hmm.
Artists are heroes too. Thinkers are heroes. I got the idea for this story device from the novel Elizabeth Costello by J.M. Coetzee, which is about an old academic woman traveling around giving lectures, not really reaching her audience sometimes. I've experienced that myself. I think we all have. Thinkers, elders, artists are not appreciated as they should be.
Indeed not. And, just to continue staying off topic for a moment, you say that in literature what we call a hero is just the focal point of the story. That's also what a hero might be in the wider world, a focal point, a differentiation of an individual from the masses. That differentiation might just be a vicarious struggle against anonymity. It's a dense concept, all tied up with hierarchies we may have inherited from apes or slugs or beyond. Its tawdry second cousin is the adoration of celebrity. And then there's another sense to heroism, the courage of altruism, where one gives up one's individuality for the greater good. You refer to it as responding obliquely to being hit in the organ of sympathy. Heroism is definitely multifaceted, don't you think?
Yeah. The function of a lot of classic literature was just to memorialize a hero, to give him some kind of immortality in verse. And that's, as you say, a kind of tawdry celebrity. And with that type of heroic fiction, you don't get inside the mind of the hero, you just see his actions. In the narrative, it is my hero's very idiosyncratic way of thinking that puts him in the right place at the right time in the right frame of mind. He's self-consciously aware of his subconscious thought process, and he takes responsibility for his thoughts and actions, even though they seem to come from chance. I would say that you're right. This story is about a process of self-individuation. A hero is someone who's responsible for his own actions. So I guess heroism is a free will question for me.
Yeah.
The old man's motivation comes from within. He's not being caused by outside forces or ideas. I would say probably that the greatest good emerges in society only if there are these self-conscious individuals examining their beliefs and motivations and deciding their own courses of action. If not, then would-be heroes tend to fall victims to warmongers and cult leaders and comic book villains who prescribe the sacrifice for them. This happens all the time, sadly. Heroes go to their graves like beds for a fantasy or a trick of fame.
In Signs and Symbols, I noticed that there's a point near the end where, on the written page, mid-sentence, you capitalized the word he when referring to the novelist. I don't know if that was accidental, but it suddenly occurred to me that this story could be read as a spiritual allegory. The novelist is God, or the idea of a creator, and the reviewer is everyman, struggling to find the big secret hidden behind the surface of this creation, this world. Am I way off base, or is this just totally obvious, or what?
If this were a typo, a miscapitalized he in the middle of the sentence, it would be, to you, a message without a sender. But you're correct. The capital H is intentional. And it points to the similarity between God as creator of heaven and earth and an author as creator of a fictional world. But in this story, the reviewer is a postmodern man. He kind of knows that there is nothing to make sense of it all. Nevertheless, there are patterns that make him yearn for a greater meaning. And I call this the postmodern sublime.
Nice.
The title, Signs and Symbols, has a semiotic illusion, at least to me. And I don't think I've ever really been able to understand semiotics. Is that the point? That there are mysteries which cannot be understood? And is that realization of the impossibility of comprehension a kind of comprehension in itself?
There's another story in this same section of the collection about an explorer who finds a standing stone on a remote island that has never been inhabited by humans. And he has to convince himself that it was formed by some natural process that he just doesn't understand. But the stone has a spooky presence that can't quite be explained away. I keep going back to this theme. My first novel, Smoking Hopes, was about a backsliding atheist who kept being tempted to believe again. A lot of semiotics is garbage, too abstract, too far-fetched. That's a nice word, isn't it, far-fetched, if you think of it quite literally?
Yeah.
Because I work in bio-semiotics, I deal with communication that is initially at least grounded in the literal, physical world, not the symbolic. And because it's so physical, communication and chemical reactions mainly, you can see the interpretations and the misassociations, and you think, I know why that cell made that mistake. It makes a kind of weird sense. So in my science work, I'm looking at these deep mysteries all the time. And when they reveal themselves, it's not humdrum mechanics that I find. It's often art, or at least pretty witty humor in a way. The misinterpretations of something as a sign can lead to real-world consequences in biology. In the narrative, a man ends up saving the lives of 2 children. So the meaning of signs and symbols is the effect that they can have.
I find it interesting that together these stories are called Message Without a Sender. It fits perfectly with the novel I'm working on, tentatively titled A Book with No Author. The ultimate mystery of creativity and imagination and how those interact with identity and so-called truth. Where do stories really come from?
Exactly. How do ideas suddenly come into being? If you go back in time and you look at your brain cells a second before the story occurred to you, you would find a surreal grouping of signals for which there could be no algorithm, no kind of sense that predicts the next move. And then boom, it all coalesces. Where did the idea come from? There aren't authors like turtles all the way down. It's something radically new.
I also find that title, Message Without a Sender, intriguing. It strikes me as somehow paradoxical. That's because I see the primary meaning of message as a communication from one entity to another, and therefore a message without a sender would not technically be a message. That semantic contradiction makes it a subtly potent title. Is this idea pertinent or relevant to your intentions?
Since a message is almost always separated from the sender, it's hard to know if it really has one or not. When we see a message, we act on the assumption that it does have a sender. But what if it doesn't and you read it anyway? Does it become a message at the point of reception?
Yeah.
I believe in new meanings. They have to start somewhere. When they emerge from the void, it's a little like a miracle. The closest thing we have to miracles is the creation of new signs and symbols. But if you don't realize that you made up the meaning, then you might be pathological.
Nice way you left both stories unresolved, just hanging on an edge. I've sometimes had people complain, but I want to know what happens next. What would you say to that?
Well, I guess we can guess what happens next in the narrative. He probably gets a standing ovation. But I wouldn't give him that ending. That's just not what it's about for him. He's learned a long time ago that recognition may never come, and he accepts that. He's content that he got the story out and that he found the words for it. If recognition comes, that's a wonderful bonus, but it's not that necessary. What happens to Minsk, the reviewer? This story has a similar plot line to Henry James's The Figure in the Carpet, where the meaning is also kept from the reader. For this story, I also had in mind Brian Boyd's review of Nabokov's Pale Fire in the Antioch Review.
One of my favorite books.
The editor asked me to review Boyd's review in the same issue. This was early, very meta. This was early 2000s, and the editor didn't know it, but Boyd and I were in this middle of this vicious public academic argument at the time. Vicious on his part, not mine, because he was the senior scholar and I was a new PhD. but we were fighting about evolutionary theory. Boyd was starting to dabble in literary Darwinism, think survival of the fittest story. You get the idea. It was really terrible. So anyway, Boyd had gone through Pale Fire like a detective, connecting all the dots, showing conclusively that John Shade was the real author of the commentary, not Kinbote. And I thought that was a very pedestrian reading that took all the art out of the story.
Yeah.
And I argued that Nabokov may indeed have put all those dots there to be connected by some master scholar like Boyd. But to give the reader that sense of a godlike meta-author performing magic, not Colonel Mustard in the library with the candlestick.
Yeah. Very recursive. I seem to have been talking about titles a lot. What if there were only titles and no texts? Would that be the ultimate mystery, or would it be a Zen koan?
I like that you brought that up, because for the longest time, I only had the title of this section for my collection. I didn't have any stories to go with it. For about a year, I looked at that section title on an empty page. Eventually, it birthed 6 stories, and maybe I'll write the title story at some point.
Tell us what you're working on currently.
Well, I'm about halfway through the sequel to my novel Locus Aminus. That book was a dark comedy about 9/11, and this one is a dark comedy/musical about COVID-19.
Well, Tori, thank you for another contribution to our podcast.
Yes, thank you.
My pleasure.
I think this podcast is sort of a message without a center, or a title without a text, or a book without an author. Don't you? This is The Strange Recital, on the web at thestrangerecital.com. The music on this episode was Humbug by Crowender. This is episode 22031. I think I may have been asleep for a few months.